This is They Create Worlds, episode 211, Ramtek.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality. You'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
Once again, we ensnare you in our web of libraries, stories, and horrors. But this time it will take place in the arcade as we look at the technicalities of Ramtek.
Yes, indeed. And not just in the arcades, but in hospitals and even all the way to the moon. Because Ramtek is actually far more than just a video game company, but of course we will be doing our primary focus on their video game activities.
So you're telling me the astronauts got to play an arcade machine on the moon. That is what I'm taking away from that statement.
Yes, if you take only one thing away from this episode. No. Please don't.
Take that away.
Please don't. But Ramtek is a very interesting company, and it's a company that speaks more to the larger things going on in Silicon Valley, even really, than it does to video games. Now, we're not going to try to comprehensively encapsulate the things they did outside of the video game industry. That's where our focus will be in this episode. But we do have to talk about some of this wider technological movement that it was a part of in order to kind of understand where it fits in and why they got into video games in the first place.
So I guess, like always, we have to start at the beginning. When was this thing founded, and who do we blame for the honor?
Well, the principal mover of the company was an engineer by the name of Charles McEwan. Charles McEwan had received training in the military in the 1950s in electrical engineering, was a technician, went into the Army just out of high school in 1954, was there for 2 years and received that electronics training that I talked about as a technician. Then when he left the service with all of that fancy new learning, he became a field engineer for Philco at their division in Palo Alto, California, right in the heart of Silicon Valley, in their Western design labs. Spent a little bit of time there, then was moved all the way across the country to the New Boston Air Force Station in New Hampshire, where Philco was working on stuff. Finally, in 1967, he joined a company called Data Disk Corporation. And this is really where our story begins, because Data Disk is a kind of fascinating company. It was founded in 1962 by a couple of guys named Armin Miller and Daniel, I'm going to horribly mispronounce it, Teichroew, Teichroew, something like that, who had both previously been at Ampex Corporation. Just like Atari, many, many years later, this is another spin-off from Ampex Corporation, which was one of the leaders in recording technology. They were not the inventors of audio tape recording. That happened over in Germany, but they brought the technology back at the end of World War II and introduced magnetic audio tape recording to the United States and became the leader there, and then also later pioneered videotape recording as well. Of course, we've talked about them some in our early Atari episodes since Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney came out of there, as did many of their early employees. So Ampex is one of these kind of Silicon Valley stalwarts, one of these key companies that spread far and wide into all of these other things, and Data Disk was another spinoff. So as they were particularly interested in magnetic data recording, they naturally kind of moved into disk-based recording. It's not quite the same thing as magnetic tape recording, but it's similar. It's still a magnetized medium where you're writing to something, in this case, a disk. They got kind of involved in hard drive stuff, and kind of their big breakthrough is they created a new read-write head that was able to operate much closer to the spinning disk than previous heads, because of course with magnetic disks you're kind of relying, and I don't know exactly how their device improved on this, but you're relying on the ability to basically measure the data there without quite actually touching the disk, which would scratch it and make horrible things happen. As the disk is spinning, of course, that air current that comes from the rapid spinning allows you to get something close to it without quite touching it. And they created a system that was able to come much, much, much closer to the disk with the read-write head than previous systems, which of course meant that you could have much larger densities of information because it could do a finer reading, so you could have smaller sectors on that disk.
Around what time was this?
This was the very beginning of the 70s was when they developed this, it looks like. The very end of the 60s or the very beginning of the 70s. Just so happens that IBM's main facility for creating their disk drives was in San Jose, California. So they connected with IBM, and IBM used their read-write head system in their famous Winchester drives that they developed for their System 370 computer, which basically became the standard for hard disks after that was introduced. So they were very important kind of in this refinement of hard disk technology here at the beginning of the 1970s.
I know you might be thinking, oh, it's interesting to have a hard drive like that. That's so cute. These hard drives in the late 60s, early 70s were huge, giant disks.
Mm-hmm.
I will throw a few pictures and videos into the show notes. They are frightening how big they were for just 100 to 200 to 300 megabytes.
Yes. Being able to increase that density is rather important because, of course, that's one step on the way to getting some miniaturization going. Because if you can get more data read in a smaller space, that means you can also eventually start shrinking down your disks as well, because you're just cramming more information into a smaller space. There was an article in Datamation from 1980, so many years after this, but was profiling Armin Miller, the co-founder of Datadisk, and that article claims that their new spinning head allowed them to record at 3,200 bits of information per inch, BPI. So that's how many bits you're writing on an inch, a physical inch of this drive, at a time when their competitors could only write data to a disk at a rate of 300 bits per inch. So we're talking an over 10 times increase in the amount of data they could write to a single inch of a magnetic disk.
That's pretty impressive to get that kind of turnaround. That's Moore's Law in action there.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a manner of speaking, it is. Similar idea. That was kind of their big claim to fame, was the way that they helped IBM kind of revolutionize this hard drive thing. But the other thing that came to them at the end of the 1960s is that they were approached by two other former Ampex engineers by the name of Fred Faust and Kurt McEwan. I don't know. It doesn't matter. None of them are at Ramtek. This isn't video game history, so it doesn't matter. But they were approached by these two other guys who had developed a device that could record analog video directly onto a hard disk. This was revolutionary in a very real way. Because, of course, the medium for recording video up to that time, I mean, there was film, of course, but Ampex did pioneer videotape in the 1950s. So there was a magnetic media that you could record video on, this being magnetic tape, but magnetic tape is a serial medium, which means you've just got all the information stacked end to end to end. If you want to access any of the data on that medium, you have to cycle all the way around to the point that you want, and then you can rewind and fast forward from there. But if you want to go to another part, you have to wind to a completely different place. Anyone like us who's old enough to remember audio cassettes and video cassettes in the home, I mean, it's the exact same principle here. It's a serial medium. This means not only do you have to put a lot more effort into seeking out what you want, but it also means things like doing slow motion or pausing or this kind of thing is really hard to do because it's just literally holding it there in place, so it's really jittery, and of course, it's not really meant to be run at those speeds or run back and forth that much in that one spot, so you're causing a lot of wear and tear on the tape and not getting a good quality image. If you've ever tried to pause a VHS tape, you know what I'm talking about. Just to give one kind of salacious example, there's a movie, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, from the early 1980s that had a very famous scene where actress Phoebe Cates, in a fantasy segment that one of the other teens is fantasizing about, walks up to a diving board at a pool, takes her top off, and dives into the pool. The word on the street is that in video rentals, the teenagers renting this particular movie would pause there quite frequently, and that many copies of the tape would actually end up being heavily, heavily degraded and have problems in that exact moment because of all of the manipulation of that exact spot of the video cassette tape. We obviously will not include that scene in the show notes. We're a family show. But, you know.
That's for the secret They Create Worlds After Dark episode that is never, maybe ever making made.
Exactly. But the point is, if you try to manipulate a particular segment of tape over and over again by pausing, rewinding, fast-forwarding, slowing it down, etc., you degrade your tape very heavily. We are bringing this up for science. It's okay.
I'm not sure. That sounds dangerously close to aperture science.
By writing this video directly to a hard disk instead, you're now putting it on a random access digital medium that you can move back and forth and pause and slow down very easily without doing any damage. So this is basically the technology that allowed for instant replay in sports, which is a huge deal. You don't see a single sporting event that doesn't have 10 million instant replays today. And of course, in most of the major sports now, instant replay can even be used by the officials, the refs, or the umpires to overturn calls and change the face of a game. So, I mean, instant replay in sports is huge. And this was the beginning of it right here. These guys coming out of Ampex and doing this. And they didn't do it exclusively for data disk. They were outsiders. But they knew the founders of Data Disk. They knew Data Disk was working with hard disks, with this magnetic disk medium. So they came to them and gave them rights to use the technology and also to OEM manufacture it for other people as well. So this got Data Disk very heavily into the video business and into the display business. That's the important key here. That's going to be the link that gets us from Data Disk Corporation to the company we're going to be talking about for the majority of the episode in Ramtek. They developed a few different uses for this. Of course, the instant replay thing in sports was one of them. They also created video disc recorders for NASA to use for things like going to the moon and recording color footage of what's going on up there. That was kind of important. They used it in X-ray systems because X-rays were derived from film. You had to take the X-rays, then you had to go develop the film, and it could be days before you get results. But if you do those X-rays and then have those images brought directly onto a video disc, onto a hard disk like this, then you can have instantaneous access as well as a little better control, maybe to zoom in and out and around on them. There were a lot of applications for this, not just sports, but also medical, scientific exploration, a huge number of applications for this. I mean, of course, everything today, is on a disc that anyone does with video anymore. Some of it is still magnetic media like they used back then. Some of it is solid state, but still, any of us that lived through the transition from VHS and audio cassette to CD and DVD, and then even beyond into all of the things we do now, streaming on Twitch, etc. That's all made possible by the technology that's being developed here by these ex-Ampex people and by Data Disk all the way back in the 1960s. Though obviously at that time, it was very expensive and not for general public consumption. This is the company that Charles McEwan joined in 1967, this Data Disk Corporation that was doing work in hard disk drives and had recently, at the time he joined, made some real breakthroughs in video. In fact, the display portion of their business became so important that in 1969, they actually split the business. It was all still under Data Disk, but they split into divisions and created a separate video systems unit as a subsidiary of Data Disk. Now, I'm not entirely clear what Charles McEwan's beef was with Datadisk. Unfortunately, he passed away in like 2006 before anyone was talking to him. We have some depositions and the like from way back in the day from him, so we have a little bit of information from him, but no one was ever able to really interview him about this stuff in more modern times from a historical perspective. We know, or at least so the story goes, that he was upset with Datadisk because he felt that this video disc technology that they had was really going to revolutionize the medical industry. And he wasn't happy with what Datadisk was doing with it. It's unclear whether he means that he was upset that they were not doing anything with it, or just that he wanted to work on this and they wouldn't let him. I think kind of the way it's been portrayed, not that there have been many sources that have covered Ramtek, but I think kind of the way it was portrayed is that he left to found his own company because he had this vision for revolutionizing the medical industry and Datadisk didn't share his vision. However, now that some people who are not me have actually gone through some newspaper archives and dug up more articles on Datadisk, it's clear that at the time he left in September 1971 to found Ramtek, Datadisk was very much applying its technology to the medical sector. They'd done this stuff with X-rays, for instance. I don't know exactly where the disconnect was, whether he thought that they weren't moving into that market fast enough, whether he thought there were other uses in medical stuff that they were not looking into, or if it's just that he thought all this video stuff was cool and he was chafing because he didn't feel like he was giving an opportunity to take part in it. I mean, it could be any one of those things, but for whatever reason, he was not happy. So he decided to leave, along with a fellow engineer by the name of John Metzler, who had worked with this video stuff, a marketing executive named H.R. Pete Kauffman, and probably a small number of other people, to go off on their own in September 1971 and found the company Ramtek to specifically enter the high-end graphical display terminal business. So that's the beginning of Ramtek in September 1971. They set up shop in Palo Alto, very near where Datadisk was located, and in early 1972 introduced their first two terminals, the GX100 and the GX200. Now, these were high-end graphical display terminals. They weren't selling computer systems. But, this is still back in the day when everything is run by these big mainframes and those kind of systems, and a lot of the interaction with these systems is being done through teletype and other paper-based systems. Graphical terminals are starting to appear in this time period. It's not like Ramtek pioneered the very concept of a display terminal. But the technology is really just starting to be adopted in certain settings. So the GX100 and GX200, which I think the difference was one was black and white and one was color, were meant to be general use terminals that you could hook into any system that you were using to display information. And they were particularly marketed at people or organizations that had to do monitoring of stuff. Because, they're really good for displaying graphs and charts and real-time readouts of numbers going up and down. So whether you're the type of person that's doing financial reports and kind of needs to see that all nice and tidy, or if it's a power plant or an industrial setting where you're having to monitor the levels of this and that, they weren't really, because these were still very expensive, they weren't really marketing them for personal use, like you and I coming up to a computer, with a keyboard and, typing in and playing adventure on them or something. Those kind of terminals existed too, but Ramtek was really going for a higher end market than that needed better displays and therefore more expensive displays. So they were that's the kind of applications they were looking for.
Would they also see them in like plane terminals and in train stations, stuff like that?
Not arrival and departure kind of stuff, but like I said, like monitoring levels of material or monitoring power levels, output levels, or, doing fancy charts or displays of financial information, not just merely arrival and departure stuff like in terminals. really high-end applications is kind of what they were going for.
See in a power plant, what you see in a water treatment facility.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
you might see maybe in an aircraft control tower for certain things.
Yeah, or something that NASA might use, that kind of stuff, because it's still very expensive technology. So those are kind of the practical uses. There are people making cheaper things in this period of time as well, but I mean, they are really targeting the high-end market. Of course, medical technology, because they were very, very interested in medical technology. And they created one of the first, it wasn't the very first, but one of the first X-ray systems that used scintillation cameras instead of the traditional fluoroscopes that were used for X-rays. Kind of the traditional way of doing X-rays is that you bombard the person with radiation, and that radiation passes through certain parts of the person and doesn't pass through certain other parts. And by kind of reading those radioactive particles scatter on the other side is how you get this X-ray image based on where the radiation went. And of course, that kind of stuff is still used today too. It's not obsolete. But the way a scintillation camera works is instead of bombarding the person with the radiation, you inject the person with a radioactive substance, and then this camera can read that within the body. Again, it can measure things. It's really good, particularly for measuring things like stuff going on in your circulatory system, because it gives you a picture of where this radioactive stuff is flowing through your body and where it isn't. So it can identify places where there are blockages or abnormalities in something like your circulatory system or your renal system or any place where a liquid of some kind is supposed to be flowing regularly.
So any kind of scan where they inject a radioactive dye, essentially.
Exactly. They released one of the first systems that could use a scintillation camera in conjunction with a video display so that you could do this in real time. Again, the systems before that primarily used film. So you could still capture this using one of these scintillation cameras, but then you had to go off and develop the film and wait several days and all of that. Whereas this allowed you to do the scanning in real time. This is the same kind of technology that's used in all sorts of scanners. It's how CAT scanners work and everything. They put you in a device, and that device does whatever science it does, and then you get this instantaneous readout of what that scanner has said about your body. That's a field that Ramtek is pioneering here. Now, they're not making the CAT scanners, they're not making the scintillation cameras, but what they're doing is they're making the terminals that can both capture the data coming in from these devices on a disk medium instead of on film, and then the display that you are viewing this data that has been captured. So they are strictly in the display terminal market. But its display is designed to interact with all of these latest scientific and medical measuring devices. So really, really cutting-edge stuff. Stuff that only a very small number of organizations are interested in or can afford. Even though it's very pioneering work, very important work, very useful work for society, it's not necessarily very profitable work. And that's a problem when you are a for-profit company. Very quickly, it became clear that they were entering a real cash flow crisis. There was very little money coming in, and the products in this field, as in many fields, were products that you sold on terms. So you gave 60, 90, 120, however many day terms, which is basically, here's your item, here's an invoice, you need to pay me within X number of days. So they were always waiting on cash to come in, and they were bootstrapping the company. They didn't have a lot of outside funding. It's not like this is a modern Silicon Valley company where there are 50 venture capitalists waiting to get you to sign on the dotted line as soon as you found a company. This is very early, when Silicon Valley is just even starting to be called Silicon Valley. You didn't have that startup infrastructure, so they're basically bootstrapping the company. As they get money in from products they sell, they're plowing it right back into the company so that they can make more products to sell to get more money to plow right back into the company. Classic bootstrapping, which is always challenging, and is especially challenging when your money isn't coming in right away and you're dealing with a very niche product. Charles McEwan and his VP of Finance, Tom Adams, were becoming very concerned about how they were going to keep a positive cash flow going. But it just so happens that Adams, the VP of Finance, owns a stake in a local area bar called Andy Capp's. Andy Capp's just happens to be on the coin-operated games route of a little, and truly at this point little, because we are talking 1972, company called Atari. It just so happens that Andy Capp's Tavern is the place where Atari decides to test their very first prototype version of Pong.
Well, we've talked about Pong before.
We have, ad nauseum, complete with Big Jeffrey's Cocktail Pong Emporium.
Really need to make a commercial for that sometime.
Indeed. We've even talked about, because we've talked about the ball and paddle market generally, we've even talked a little bit about how Ramtek made some of these discoveries. Obviously, there's going to be a little overlap, but we're going into much more depth here. Because Tom Adams was a part owner of Andy Capp's was a regular hangout for the Ramtek engineers. Just, when they're on their off hours having fun or whatever. So the engineers at Ramtek noticed Pong almost right away. And we're talking about the very first test unit before they were entering mass production on this thing. The very beginning in the summer of 1972 here. Engineers and marketing people, because Pete Kauffman, who I mentioned, the marketing person who came with him from Data Disk, is also amongst those that saw it. And Pete Kauffman remembers that when he went over to look at it, this original unit was not a floor unit. It actually sat on top of a barrel at the bar. Atari didn't provide the barrel, it's just that's what was convenient to set it on. We can throw some pictures of the original prototype in the show notes because it still exists, and I'm sure we probably have in past episodes. But it was not a floor model, it was a tabletop model, so it was just sitting there on top of a barrel. Pete Kauffman remembers trying to move the unit and that it was very, very heavy, which said to him that it had lots and lots of money making it very heavy, lots of quarters that people had put into the machine. The engineers liked it. The engineers had fun playing it. They could kind of tell, just by kind of feeling the weight of the thing, that this thing was taking in some money. Really, all it is a very specific type of display terminal, and indeed not nearly as high-end a display terminal as Ramtek is already making. So Ramtek already has a factory that can make video games, essentially. They've already got engineers that understand exactly how this video stuff works. They have learned about this product before it is widely available. So suddenly here it is, the solution to all of their problems. We can make money making video games and selling video games, coin-operated, arcade games. So that is exactly what they do. Of course, it takes them a few months to work out all the details. But in March 1973, which is after Pong has been released, but just about the same time Pong is going nationwide. We won't kind of rehash all that history because we've done it before, but basically, because Atari was such a small bootstrapped operation with zero manufacturing capacity, even though they initially introduced the game in November of 72, they weren't able to really start selling it outside of the local area until March of 73. So right at the same time Atari is going nationwide, Ramtek is introducing their first game, Volley, which is essentially a Pong clone. I don't want to call it a clone because a clone is a copy. And unlike many of the companies that went into the business, Ramtek did not copy Pong. Obviously, they took very good notes about what they saw at Andy Capp's so that they could recreate it. But they didn't take a circuit board and recreate it trace for trace, chip for chip. They built their completely own unit all by themselves because they had the expertise to do that. So it's a Pong clone in the sense that it is imitating the gameplay of Atari's Pong, but it was an original creation of Mr. John Metzler, the co-founder of the company, that he did himself without ripping off anything that Atari had done before him.
It actually looks way more advanced. It almost looks like one of the second or third generation Pong things that came out.
Yeah, well, they had a lot of experience with the technology and with industrial design and all of this stuff. Experience that Atari did not have. Atari was really learning on the fly. Obviously, there were some things that were new to Ramtek, like coin control, getting a coin door in there and that kind of thing. But the electronics were very simple compared to what they were doing in graphical displays. The display was very primitive compared to what they were doing in graphical displays. So it was pretty darn easy for them to make something competent, even though they had never done anything in games before. Of course, they were also new to distribution in the coin-op space, not something they'd ever had to do before. They were coming in at a time when everybody was looking to cash in on this Pong thing, which we've talked about. We don't have to go there again. So it was pretty easy to find distributors. They just called up some of the local distributors. They ended up getting probably their largest order from Row International, the jukebox company, which also had an extensive distribution network. Row was looking to break into this business from a distribution perspective, not a manufacturing perspective, gave them a big old order for 2,500 units, and they were now in the coin-op business where, again, Pong was so popular that the cash came in immediately. Traditionally, the coin-op business had been based on terms, just like many other businesses, but Pong was so popular that distributors were taking them and giving you cash right away because they did not want to miss out on the market. Just to give you an idea of how this turned around their business, because Charles McEwan did a deposition in the Bally versus William pinball cases, where he went into some of the financials of the company, and he was doing some of these off the top of his head. He had documents for some of this, but not all of it. So these numbers may not be 100% accurate, but they're close enough to give us an idea of what's going on. Their fiscal year ran through June 30th. So their first fiscal year was a 9-month fiscal year. It was September 1971 to June 1972, June 30th. In that first fiscal year, they did $98,000 worth of business. Because they're just getting started up. I mean, they're having to get a factory set up. They're having to develop products. I mean, they're not selling straight through that 9 months, I don't think. So they're just getting started. They do about $98,000 worth of business. Second year, fiscal year ending June 1973, they do $2 million worth of business.
That's a bit of an increase.
Of that $2 million, $500,000 of it was their high-end graphics terminal business. And the other $1.5 million, 75% of the money they brought in, was from their brand new video game business.
Yeah, why are we doing these high-end displays anymore when we can be making much more money?
Oh, well, I mean, the high-end display is still what they want to do. We'll see why it will continue to be what they do as we go on through the episode as well. That's the real work that they're passionate about. They're not passionate about video games. This is bringing in the money that allows them to do the thing that they are passionate about. Of course, they immediately follow it up with additional product. Unlike a lot of the clone makers, and we talked about this in our Pong clone episode, so we don't have to go into great detail on this again here. Since, unlike their competitors, they had a lot of expertise with displays and with electronic systems, they were one of the companies that was doing more interesting things. They weren't just doing, here's a Pong, now here's a Pong for 4 players, now here's a Pong wearing a hat. They were able to do slightly more interesting things. So they did release a couple of games right afterwards, in 73, hockey and soccer, that were still ball and paddle games, but they were a little more interesting. And we've talked about this, where you have a goal to defend and you have kind of multiple paddles representing players on the screen. And the idea is to try to knock the ball into the opposing player's goal rather than to, just get it by them off the edge of the screen. They're doing some more interesting things even in 1973. And then in 1974, they start getting really interesting. And we talked about this some in our Pong episode as well, but they did 3 games in 1974 that were really starting to move the market in slightly different directions. The first of these, and probably the least of these, is the game Wipeout, which was, once again, just like all the early games, created by John Metzler. We talked about this in our Pong episode, but Wipeout copied essentially the Atari game Elimination, where you had up to 4 players, each with a paddle on one edge of the screen, and they were basically defending their side of the screen. And if you let the ball get past you a certain number of times, you were eliminated, your hole on your side of the screen filled in, and then, you're not part of the game anymore, and the last person standing wins. Wipeout added what they called a frustration bumper in the middle of this, which was this cross-shaped thing. And we talked about this in the Pong Clones episode. It was this cross in the middle of the field that just allowed more opportunities for ricochets all around the field. You couldn't just hit the ball straight to the guy on the other side of you because there was a structure in the way. You had to do a lot more complex bank shots and the like to go after your opponent. So it was just a little more complex and kind of a neat way of taking a concept that Atari did and tweaking it in a way to make it more interesting. Now, the other two games of the year were far more significant, and these games actually came from another engineer, because Metzler was actually on the brink of retiring. He wasn't that old, but he started kind of backing away from the day-to-day. I mean, he had designed all of the early products at the company. He was doing both their graphical display stuff and their video game stuff. He held the rank of executive vice president. He was a co-founder. He was a big part of what was going on. But at this point, he starts backing off. He's still technically there. He's still technically executive vice president, but he's not really doing a lot of work anymore. He's kind of leaning towards retiring. So they need new people. A guy named Gaiman Schultz takes over as kind of the overall head of engineering, but they need new talent to do the video game thing. They end up connecting with an individual by the name of Hal Ivey. We've, of course, talked about Ivey on the show here before as well, because we've talked about some of these things before. And, of course, he is somebody that I have interviewed. Hal Ivey was an Air Force officer who joined the Air Force out of school. He went to Georgia Tech in the 1960s, and in 1972 was stationed at the Air Force's satellite test facility on Onizuka Air Force Station, which was right in the heart of Silicon Valley. He had electronics training. He was an electrical engineer. He also had a lot of experience with video because he was working at this satellite facility, and so a lot of what he was working with was telemetry. That's all, video signals and whatnot is being used for the telemetry. So he understands video signals. He understands electronics. Just like the people at Ramtek, he has the skill set that you can really use to make video games. And just like the people at Ramtek, he's in Sunnyvale, right in the heart of Silicon Valley. In 1972, he discovered the game Computer Space. Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney's first game, at a bar or whatever someplace, just saw it there and played it. And he was like, this is really cool. And of course, he saw Pong after that when Pong came out, and he got to thinking to himself, I think I can make one of these. So he has the necessary skills with video and with electronics. So he actually, in his 2-bedroom apartment, in the second room of his 2-bedroom apartment, he puts together his own little Pong clone, just because he can. When he was done with it, he went around to companies in the local area, showed it to Ramtek. Ramtek was suitably impressed by this thing. They gave him $2,000 for his design. They didn't use it, but they saw that this guy really knew what he was doing, and so they wanted to lock him up and take him off the market. So they paid him $2,000 for his game and offered him a job to make more games for them, because they were needing a new engineer anyway, with Metzler starting to step back. So in the beginning, he did not quit his job with the Air Force. So he continued to work for the Air Force at the satellite test facility during the day, and then on nights and weekends, he began designing video games as a second job. The 2 games that he put out in 1974 are really the first games that are very important that Ramtek did, because they were deviating kind of from the norm of the other Pong clones. The first of these games, which we did also talk about at some of our other episodes, is the game Clean Sweep. With Clean Sweep, what Hal Ivey really wanted to do is, he liked the ball and paddle games, the Pong games and all of that, but he wanted to do something that really was way more action-packed and really used the whole screen better than the current games did. Because with the ball and paddle games, most of the time you have a paddle or 2 paddles or whatever on one extreme end of the screen, and your opponent has the same on the other extreme end of the screen. Yes, you have to follow the path of the ball across all of that intervening space, but the rest of the screen isn't really being used. There's not a lot of simultaneous hectic action going on. Compare that to, say, a pinball table, where even though the basic function is just a ball, usually a single ball, though of course multi-ball is a thing, and a couple of paddles, again, usually just a couple at the very bottom of the table, though there can be various paddles placed elsewhere. even though you have these simple elements, there's action going on all over that playing field as that thing ricochets off of bumpers and targets and all of this crazy stuff goes on. So Hal Ivey's thinking to himself, how can I make a game that makes better use of this full screen while still being in kind of this ball and paddle paradigm? So he came up with the idea for the clean sweep game where you still have just your one paddle, in this case at the bottom of the screen. Instead of just being empty space everywhere else, the entire screen is filled with these balls. You need to use your paddle to bounce a ball around and knock out, eliminate, sweep away, clean sweep, all of these other balls on the screen to win the game. Obviously, if you fail to keep the ball going with your paddle, then you lose a life or whatever.
It's really nice because you have a domed paddle, so it really helps with that whole guessing what the angle is going to be.
Exactly. So if anyone who hasn't listened to our past ball and paddle episodes and who doesn't know the history is thinking to themselves now, geez, that sounds an awful lot like Breakout. Well, yes. Hal Ivey, as we've talked about in other episodes, including our Breakout episode, is essentially the inventor of the Breakout concept. And in fact, it was Clean Sweep that was informing the people at Atari when they did Breakout. It's not exactly the same because there are no physics to any of the objects on the screen except for the ball and the paddle. So when you're eliminating the targets, it's not ricocheting off the targets like they do in Breakout. It just passes right through them and they disappear from the screen. But it is basically the Breakout, the very beginning of the Breakout concept. And it came entirely from this idea of, I've got this big blank screen where there's not much going on during my ball and paddle game. How can I make that all more dynamic and more exciting? So we did Clean Sweep. Yes, you mentioned the curved paddle. As you said, that was a deliberate move that he did in order to make it more obvious what the angles would be, because all of these ball and paddle games, going straight back to Atari's original, used segmented paddles where the angle of return would be different depending on which part of the paddle it hit. But of course, the graphics were just these very flat rectangles, so it was not obvious when looking at the object on the screen how it was going to bank. Hal Ivey wanted to make that a little more clear, so he chose to use that curved paddle. This, of course, necessitated actually using memory, because the main reason that those early ball and paddle games just had the rectangles is because you didn't really need any graphical memory, any screen memory to portray that. So now that required memory to store that image, and he used one of the very first, not quite the very first, but one of the very first ROM chips in a video arcade game in order to display that curved shape of the paddle. So it was technologically very innovative. He also, as far as I know, as we always say on the show, firsts are always a very fraught subject, so we can always potentially come across something that actually predates. But he is also, to my knowledge, the first person to use RAM memory in an arcade video game. He used that to facilitate the disappearance of the dots because, of course, you have all of these dots on the screen. They need to disappear, and you have to constantly update the display as dots disappear so that the computer knows what dots should still be generated. So you need random access memory for that. It's very technologically impressive, and it's a very interesting gameplay concept. It doesn't hit quite in the same way that Breakout does a few years later. I think that extra element of having the physics of the ricochets off of the objects really makes for an even better, more interesting game, but of course was really just beyond the technology to do necessarily effectively in 1974. It doesn't take off quite like that, but estimates put the sales at somewhere around 3,000, 3,500 units, which was very good for a game in this time period of 1974, when we may recall the Pong market is in complete collapse and video games are not necessarily doing the best. That is a very good sales figure. According to McEwan's deposition, it went back into production multiple times, which doesn't happen very often in the coin-op industry, but when you do put something back in production, it means that demand has exceeded what you expected, and there's so much demand that you've decided it's worth it to put it back on the factory floors. The fact that it returned to manufacturing 2 times also indicates that it was definitely one of the popular games of the time. That was a pretty big deal. The other one, and there's some people in Gaming Alexandria that, just like they were waiting for Bubsy in our Accolade episode, we're definitely waiting for this one here. It's a bit of a in-joke amongst all of us, is Ramtek Baseball, which was truly outstandingly complicated game for the time because it had animated characters on the screen. Now, unfortunately, we have no video of it. So if you're looking for video, you'll be disappointed. All we have are flyer images and whatnot, and a few images of dormant cabinets in real life, but there's no video of it. This was a very basic pitch and bat baseball game of a type that had been in arcades and electro-mechanical format for decades. But, of course, it's all computerized, so you have one player controlling the batter who has to swing and try to hit a pitch. The other is controlling the pitcher and controlling the ball that's being thrown, which you can put some moves on to make it more deceptive. Then you also control some of the animated fielders as well in trying to track down the ball. So it has a lot of characters on the screen. It has animated characters, which is very rare for the time. We don't know exactly how many of the characters were animated or how much stuff was moving at one time. We really need to find some video of this. Someone needs to find one and film it sometime so that we get a better idea. One friend of the show, who is also at GA, Nate up in Buffalo, is working on doing a modern recreation of it. He bought some schematics. He found some schematics online from somebody and bought schematics. He has some electrical engineering know-how, so he's had boards made based on the original schematics. I had a company do them for him. It's not done yet, but he's trying. He's trying to recreate Ramtek baseball based on the original schematics. And I would love to see it because it's definitely, just from looking at a flyer description and what little we have, we know it was definitely groundbreaking technologically, but we don't know how groundbreaking. And we won't know until we can actually play it and see footage of it. But definitely just the fact that you have so many characters on the screen, that at least some number of those characters are animated, that's all very sophisticated for 1974. In fact, its technological sophistication ended up being its undoing. Because with all of these advanced features that it had, we have to remember this is before microprocessors were introduced into video games. So everything is being done through transistor-to-transistor logic, TTL hardware. Individual transistors, individual microchips. Having all of those characters and having them animated and everything, that took a lot of TTL hardware. That means that it actually had to be spread across 2 PCBs inside the cabinet, 2 printed circuit boards. These 2 PCBs had to be able to talk to each other. They had to be connected by some kind of connector cable. This is not a new thing. Obviously, computers have had multiple circuit boards since the dawn of time. You do the same thing that you do today when you have to have multiple computer hardwares together and talking to each other. You just get yourself a rack and you rack them together. Unfortunately, the economics of the coin-op industry were such that these games are rather expensive and they have to keep the price down to a degree for operators, so they cheaped out a little bit on the housing for the PCBs and went with a wooden housing. These boards were very heavy boards. The poor wooden housing could not properly support them. The poor wooden housing would break, and then game no worky no more.
First the wood breaks, then the circuit board breaks, then the power goes out.
That's right. They made 2,000 of these, and that number comes straight from McEwan in his deposition, so it's probably a good number. They made 2,000 of these, but 1,500 of them were defective. 75%, here's that 75% number again, of the baseball units they made were defective. They had to go out into the field and retrofit them with a metal housing that could take the strain, all at great personal cost to them. This was a problem.
No wonder so few of them survived to the modern times.
Yeah, very finicky. It had an interesting cabinet, too, because it was actually the original version. They released a version later called Deluxe Baseball that was in a standard cabinet. But the cabinet, which you can find images of online, so we can include that in the show notes, it was a shorter cabinet that you had to look down into. And then they had this sculpture, the sculpt of a baseball stadium surrounding the monitor. So the idea was you were kind of at the blimp's eye view of like the Goodyear blimp or something, and you were looking down into the stadium watching the action unfold. So it was a very clever cabinet, but also, not the most practical of cabinets. And like I said, they did eventually re-release it as Deluxe Baseball in a standard cabinet. The game was a hit, sort of. A minor hit. 2000, again, is not huge, but for a game in 74, 75, because they were still selling them in 75, that was pretty good for a video game in that time period. It did well, but they were actually losing money on this darn thing because of the problems, and that actually put them in a bit of a pickle. They were trying at this exact same time to bust out of this video game thing. They decided they liked the coin-op business. They really liked the coin-op business, and I already told you their 73 number. I'll now throw their 1974 numbers out there. Again, this all comes from McEwan's deposition. In 1974, they did $4.2 million in sales. So their sales more than doubled from $2 million in 1973 to $4.2 million in 1974. This time, $2.2 million of that was in games, and roughly $2 million of it was in high-end graphics. They're closing the gap with their high-end graphics business. It's only roughly half their business that's in video games now instead of 3/4 of their business. But still, the video games are still the slightly more popular and are still doing a big part of propelling their business forward. This was in a down year for video games, we have to remember, 1974. So they liked the coin-op business. They liked that they could get cash up front. They liked that the stuff was very simple to make compared to their high-end stuff and was cheaper compared to their high-end stuff. They wanted to stay in the business. But after that collapse of that Pong market in 1974, they were very skittish about staying in video games. Because remember, at this time, video games, and specifically the ball and paddle video games, as we talked about in that episode, they were just the latest fad. Nobody at this time was thinking, oh, now there's this thing called the video game, and the video game is going to sweep away everything else in the arcade and dominate, as it did for a brief period of time in the late 70s and early 80s. Nobody was thinking that. People were thinking that this was just another fad, and they weren't really thinking about the video game as a broad category. They were thinking of the video game as this ball and paddle thing. Obviously, some companies like Atari and like to even a degree Ramtek are looking at ways to expand beyond that, but the industry as a whole, which doesn't understand the technology, just sees this as a ball and paddle fad that is going to die out just like a million fads before it died out in the coin-op industry. It's a novelty business, as we've talked about many times before. Ramtek was very leery about their only point of contact with this industry being video games. They were afraid that if they stayed in just video games only, that this gravy train was going to run out on them and they were going to be in big trouble. But they liked the business. They felt really good there. So they decided they had to get into more of a staple product. So they immediately identified as the logical staple product to get into as pinball. Pinball, while it has not always been the most profitable segment of the coin-op industry, has typically always been pretty high up there. And the thing is, as other fads have come and gone, pinball has been a constant. It has always been there. It has been the bread and butter of the industry.
Pinball is eternal.
Exactly. Pinball at this time is also ripe for modernization. We've talked about kind of the move to solid-state pinball that would go on right about in this time period. Ramtek didn't want to deviate from the core business that it understood, which was doing electronics manufacturing. They didn't want to get into traditional electro-mechanical pinball with its steppers and its relays and its motors and all of these complicated things that can break down and are very finicky, all connected by a rat's nest of wires. They want to stay within their core competency of electronics, but they see pinball as an area that is ripe, as did several other companies in this time period, all competing to be the first, including Atari, including Dave Nutting Associates, things we talked about before, see pinball as ripe for a transition to solid state. And then if you can get into solid state pinball and get in the bread and butter of the industry, then you have a nice, consistent business in coin-op that you can use as your baseline, and then you can do whatever other fancy stuff you're doing on top of it. They very much wanted to get into the pinball business. So he went around, he visited some of the other companies, some of the Chicago companies, kind of got a sense of what that market looked like, did some estimates on kind of the finances of it and everything. Ramtek launched a mission to get involved in the pinball business. They hired a designer from Williams by the name of Bob Genesi to do the design of the pinball table, the actual deciding of what the play field is going to look like, where the targets are going to be, what the flow of the gameplay is going to be. And they hired one of the pioneers, one of the kind of unsung pioneers in microprocessors, Ray Holt, as a consultant to be their primary programmer on the pinball machine. Though Hal Ivey, who has now gone completely internal after the success of Clean Sweep, he did leave the Air Force and is now a full-time employee of Ramtek, is also working on this and actually learns a lot about how microprocessors work and how to do pinball gameplay and all of this kind of thing by working on this project, which will be very important to his career going forward. They assemble this team in 1974 is when they're working on this, and create a pinball prototype using an Intel microprocessor called Lucky Dice. They exhibit it privately at the MOA show in their hospitality suite. They don't have it at their booth on the show floor, but they showed at their hospitality suite. They try to solicit interest from companies that may want to license the technology or who may want to help them manufacture it or just may want to distribute it, try to figure out what they can do to get into the pinball business. Unfortunately for Ramtek, this happens at the exact time that baseball is having all of these problems. So the company is actually once again temporarily in a cash flow crunch. They determine that it is probably going to take about $2 million. This is again according to McEwan's deposition. It's going to take about $2 million to enter the pinball business. Get the machine all done, get manufacturing geared up, order parts, all the stuff that goes into launching a new product. They had been planning to fund this entry into the pinball business with their obscene video game profits, which had now just suddenly dried up because of the baseball debacle. So at the end of the day, they do not enter the pinball business. They have a couple of prototypes. They have lots of people come around and play it. They try to interest some people in licensing the technology to maybe try to get some kind of return on this. But Lucky Dice is never released. Ramtek never enters the pinball business. And they lost their opportunity to get that bread and butter foundational coin-operated product and ended up having to stay wedded to video games. Not long after this, they also receive another blow because that marketing executive that I mentioned earlier that had been at Datadisk with Charles McEwan and had seen Pong at Andy Capp's and all of that, Pete Kauffman, had become so excited back in 1973 about the prospect of these video games that he decided to do the exact same thing that Charles McEwan did. Charles McEwan got excited about display terminals and medical imaging technology at Datadisk, so was like, I will found my own graphics terminal company with blackjack and hookers, and formed Ramtek. Kauffman came with him from there. Now Kauffman is so excited about this video game thing that he's like, these video games are amazing. I'll go found my own video game company with blackjack and hookers. So he leaves Ramtek in 1973 to found the company Exidy, solely dedicated to the creation of video games. And he starts taking employees over time from his former employer at Ramtek. John Metzler, who, as I said, was kind of halfway out the door in 1974 and considering retirement, ends up joining Kauffman at Exidy. Then in 1975, Hal Ivey, the person that has created most of their hit video game product after Metzler left, leaves Ramtek to go join Kauffman at Exidy.
They're definitely getting a brain drain there and poaching a lot of really good and talented people.
Yes. We're getting a brain drain right at a period of time when they're having some trouble. They can't enter the pinball business, and their video game business for the rest of their time in the business gets kind of weird. Or their coin-op business, I should say. There's still some hesitance, and we don't have really anything from McEwan or anyone on this. While I've interviewed Ivey, Ivey's gone in the latter part of this, so he has no insight into what's going on at Ramtek. We don't really have a lot of insight into Ramtek past about 1975. But their output gets very strange and very diverse. I can only imagine, based on the deposition and the way he was saying that, we were leery of the video game market and we wanted to get into other areas, that I assume a lot of this was just trying to find a niche that they thought may be more resilient than video games that would allow them to kind of have a good baseline of product in the industry that they could build on. They were never trying to get out of video games. And they continue to release video games, a couple of which we're going to talk about here. But they also keep going in other directions as well. One of the first of those, which is actually technically a video game, but is just not a traditional action or driving or shooting game like we think of, is one of the last games Ivy worked on before he left for Exidy, which is the 1975 game Trivia. Trivia is microprocessor-based, again, using some of that expertise that they learned doing the pinball thing. It's a trivia game, exactly what it says. This is something that had been very popular for a brief period of time in the late 1960s and had kind of fallen by the wayside. And now Ramtek's trying to bring it back, I think, again, because they're trying to find somewhere outside of the traditional video game where they can make a mark. And again, they're coming to this with a microprocessor system. So, those old games, some of them were electro-mechanical, a couple of them were solid state, but none of them were microprocessor driven. So just like they were trying to reinvent pinball through the microprocessor, I think they were probably also trying to kind of bring back this coin-op trivia thing that had been a fad briefly at the end of the 60s by incorporating a microprocessor. It's actually interesting the way that they made this be random without causing a lot of wear and tear. Because, of course, at this time, you weren't storing all of the trivia questions in memory. You were still using tape in there to store the questions because you needed to have lots and lots of questions, more than, you could fit into memory at a time when memory was expensive. So Ivy came up with a kind of interesting way to randomize the questions despite the fact that they were on the serial format without causing problems by having, the tape just going back and forth all the time or whatever, which would cause wear on the tape.
Sounds like a prime target for that hard drive.
Hard drive's too expensive.
Yeah, I know. If they could get it cheap enough for it, there would be prime example for it.
Yeah. No, it really would be. So the way it worked is as soon as you put a quarter in the machine, the tape would start spinning. A question would appear. I don't know how the question went from the tape. I think there was a computer in there. So I think the individual question that you were asking was pulled off the tape. Some magnetic medium was pulled off the tape and into memory and then displayed on the screen. That's how you got your question. But the tape would start spinning the moment that you put your quarter in. Then it wouldn't stop on a question until you answered the previous question. So basically, however long it took you to answer a question, that determined where in the tape it would stop to ask the next question, because it would just keep constantly spinning.
Presumably they have the tape in there in a constant loop, not like a set tape where they have to rewind it and then redo it. It's just set there as one giant loop.
Exactly, one giant loop, and just every time you answered a question, it would stop long enough to pull a question into memory, and then it would start spinning again. And so that ensured perfect randomization, because you're never going to take the exact same amount to answer a question. So, if it takes 10 seconds, then, the tape moves forward 10 seconds and then asks another question. If it takes you 30 seconds, it's 30 seconds forward. A rather ingenious way to have complete randomization of the questions without doing a lot of weirdness with memory or with moving the tape back and forth or even having to start and stop the tape too often. It's just every time you answer a question, the tape stops briefly, loads another question into memory, and then, you move on with the game. So that's kind of a cool little tidbit.
Why do I see speedrunners starting it at a certain spot and then are able to answer every single question in rapid order because they memorize the entire route, and if they hit it at the right timing, they get to the end?
Indeed. Sounds frightening.
It is, but I've seen them do some frightening manipulations of random before.
Speedrunning is often very frightening. That would not be out of place in that sense. That's kind of what's going on with the video game business right now. We also need to talk a little bit about what's going on in their other business. After all, it's all interconnected. This microprocessor pinball endeavor was not at all a coincidence. Because, I mean, obviously they were trying to get into pinball, this bread and butter part of the coin-op industry. But this is the exact same time they were looking to introduce microprocessors into their graphics display terminals as well. So there was a certain synergy here, just like they got into video games with the idea of, oh, we're already doing this kind of work, we understand how this works. They got started, I think, on the pinball maybe slightly before they got started on the graphic systems. I'm not positive. I don't have their internal documents or anything. But you kind of have the same idea. It's like, well, microprocessors are coming to the graphical terminal world, so it makes sense for us to also try to incorporate this technology into coin-op and specifically into pinball. So they actually bought a company in 1975 called Micro Machines from a guy named Larry Crummell, who they then employed to create an in-circuit emulator for the 8080 microprocessor to help with development of these terminals. Just as things are kind of really going well for their terminal business, which has been slowly and steadily gaining steam this entire time, in November 1975, they suffer a devastating fire at their main factory, at their main building, really. A large part of their graphics terminal manufacturing facility completely burns down.
But isn't that why you have insurance?
Funny you should mention that.
Oh, God. I meant that as a joke.
This is indeed the reason why you have insurance. However, insurance companies require these things called premiums, Jeffrey.
Yes?
And if you miss your premium, even by like 1 second past midnight, insurance policies tend to lapse. It just so happens that Ramtek had accidentally allowed their policy to lapse just a few weeks before this fire happened.
So the fire happened and they were not insured.
Exactly. So we can confirm that they did not set this fire for the insurance money, because there was no insurance money. However, they were somehow able to convince their banks to float them the money they needed to get back into business. The entire corporation, everyone came together. About 90 Ramtek employees and their family came to the site to clear away the rubble so that he could build a temporary manufacturing facility. They were able to miraculously keep the company going despite this disastrous situation. Certainly, the continued success of the video games, despite the fact that they hit a little bit of a hiccup with the pinball and with the Ramtek baseball, as we talked about, certainly didn't hurt. By March 1976, according to reports at the time, Ramtek had sold 20,000 video games since its founding. To kind of put in perspective where the growth has been, there had previously been a report that at the end of 1974, they had manufactured 10,000 games. In just a little over a year, they had doubled the number of games they had manufactured from around 10,000 to around 20,000. In 1975, they were one of the top companies in the business. Now, the business was pretty small at this point, so that's not necessarily something to write home about. They were well behind the leaders Atari and Midway, but they were one of the top 4 companies in video games in the year 1975. They're doing pretty okay, but they've still got this kind of weird aversion to the video game business. And I think probably part of what's going on here is, the video game business is very volatile, as we said. They've also had this brain drain. They've lost their talent, Metzler and Ivy, that made their early video games. They've been happy with the profits that they've been able to make, other than, like I said, that little blip in 75 in video games, but it's never been their core business. As the video games get more sophisticated, as microprocessors are introduced, as innovative control schemes are introduced, different cabinet types, etc., as it becomes more complex, you really have to put a lot more focus into doing it well. I mean, it's not like Ramtek was dogging it. I mean, their early games have some great games in there, but one guy could do them, and they weren't that complex. It wasn't microprocessors, etc. I mean, when they tried to introduce pinball, and it was going to cost them $2 million to do it. I mean, it's getting harder and harder to do a video game as kind of a side job. It kind of more has to be your everything. I imagine that Charles McEwan just didn't want video games to be their everything, even though he liked what they were doing in coin ops. they're doing these weird experiments. I mean, we already talked about trivia. They continued to do other things after that. In 1976, they create an electromechanical game called Horoscope, which is not really a game at all. It's just kind of a horoscope machine. These self-help movements are very popular in the mid-1970s. Astrology has become very popular in the mid-1970s. There was this book on so-called biorhythms made in 1975 that became this huge fad across the United States. In fact, there are several biorhythm-related video games that were created in this time period, both in the home and the arcade, as part of this weird little fad. So this horoscope machine kind of fits into that, but it's electromechanical. It's not a video game.
Yeah, it's very electromechanical. You got dials and stuff on it. It looks like something that doesn't use the advanced hardware that you would expect out of a video game, or even some of the TTL hardware that they would start using in pinballs and other amusement devices.
Exactly. I mean, they're going full-on electromechanical. In 1978, they do a game called Dark Invader, which is not a video game. It actually uses an actual laser and a spinning mirror, and you have to shoot down alien spaceships that appear on the playfield that are created from pieces of heavy gauge wire that have been painted in fluorescent colors and spun under UV lamps to create a strobe effect. It's a purely electromechanical device. There's no video of this that I could find, unfortunately, because I'd love to see that in action. But it's very fascinating, but it's not a video game. In 1979, they do a projection driving game called GT Roadster, like the old Chicago Coin Speedway and games like that. I shouldn't even say that. It's using 8mm film, so it's more like a Casco's game, The Driver. Basically similar to the driving simulators that you may recall us being subjected to in high school as part of driver's ed.
Yeah, those things needed a little thing called resistance in their wheels and their pedals.
Yes. They're doing all of these other types of games, and I think it's because they're trying to find a way to stay in that doesn't require them to enter a video game arms race, because I think they're feeling like if they have to stay in coin-op through video games, they're going to end up losing in the end because it's just becoming too intense to create interesting new product. Now, they are still releasing video games as well in this later time period. None of them are particularly hits. Like I said, their creative people are gone. I don't know who made their later video games in the later 1970s, but I do get the sense that they were not necessarily as adept as the Hal Iveys of the world at this kind of thing. Most of their games really don't do anything. They do a Space War-like game called Star Cruiser in 1977. It has these weird U-shaped steering controllers. It's kind of a combination of a driving and a shooting game in space that is clearly a reaction to Star Wars, because there are definitely things that look like Y-Wings and TIE Fighters on the cabinet. They do a 4-player game called Sea Battle that I don't really know much about because there's no video of it anywhere. They're still doing some video games, but most of them don't go anywhere. The only game in this period that they have that really does hit, and it's only a minor hit, but it does actually appear on the charts, which is more than we can say for their other games, is the 1977 game M79 Ambush. M79 Ambush is very clearly a Seawolf derivative. Midway and Dave Nutting Associates' classic target shooting game involving a submarine. Except instead of peering through a periscope and shooting at targets at sea, you're using this giant gun controller loosely derived from the M79 grenade launcher, hence the name of the game, to shoot at trucks and tanks and other military targets that are zooming across the screen at different speeds, which is exactly what Seawolf is. There's nothing shooting back at you. These are pre-Space Invaders shooting gallery style games, but the targets are moving at various speeds, and so the challenge is to time your shots to hit the highest quality targets and amass the highest score you can, while, and this is a twist, also avoiding hitting UN trucks that'll come across the screen, which will cause you to lose points. I haven't done the research well enough to know, but this may be one of the first instances where a shooting video game of this kind had things that you had to avoid shooting in addition to things that you want to shoot, something that has been very common in shooting games up to the present day. where you lose points if you shoot a friendly. That's an interesting thing that they added.
Did they do the same thing that they did with Seawolf, where they had actual physical assets in there in order to provide visual interest on the playfield?
They absolutely did. So unfortunately, I imagine you were looking, unfortunately on YouTube, there is gameplay footage of M79, but it's all emulated footage from inside MAME. It's not footage taken from an actual cabinet. We'll obviously put the game in the show notes, but it doesn't capture the full effect of the cabinet because it did have graphical elements. You can kind of see them on the flyer, though you don't get a good look at them. But they had those additional elements to make it more interesting, absolutely. The other thing that's interesting about it is it did record the high score on the machine. Of course, Space Invaders is usually considered the beginning of high score chasing, but it is not the first game that actually had a high score. Seawolf had a high score tracker. But the thing about Seawolf's high score tracker is there was a button on the machine. We talked about this in our Dave Nutting episode, I think. There was a button on the machine that the player himself could use to reset the score. Even though it maintained a score, that score could be erased by a player at any time. M79 also recorded the highest score achieved on the machine, but in this case, the player could not change it. The owner of the cabinet, or the operator of the cabinet, could reset the score by unlocking the cabinet, going inside, and fiddling with a mechanism in there, but the player could not alter it. This is a kind of a key game, I suppose, on the path to score chasing as well, and what Space Invaders did there. Actually, the setup is very similar to Space Invaders. You have player 1 score on one side, player 2 score on the other side, and the high score in the middle. It's at the bottom of the screen, while Space Invaders is at the top of the screen. But it's a very similar layout, and so I do have to wonder if Nishikado didn't take some inspiration from that display when he was coming up with his own idea of doing high scores. Though I do think Seawolf probably influenced Nishikado more than M79 when it came to the high score concept in general. So it was a minor hit. It was a fun little game. People liked it. They had that, and they had a couple of other video games. But on the whole, this company that was one of the top 4 companies in the business in 1975 and did some very innovative stuff with Clean Sweep and baseball and even to an extent trivia, was clearly on a decline in the video game business. That is very much bears out in their numbers as well. So I'll go back to my litany here that Charles McEwan gave in his deposition of the sales figures. And by the way, we have these depositions, I should mention, thanks to Ethan Johnson, friend of the show, who pulled this case out of the National Archives facility in Chicago and scanned all of these. As always, a lot of what we do around here can't be done without what others in the business are doing, and especially our friend of the show, Ethan Johnson. Going back to this litany of their sales, in 1975, they did $6 million in total business, up from $4.2 million. $4 million of that in games and $2 million in graphics. So after that kind of hiccup in 74, when the video game business declined across the industry, not just Ramtek's business, they're back in action again here with 2-to-1 in terms of sales coming from video games. But then in 76, they're starting to get more contracts. In fact, in 77, one of the big things they end up doing is their monitors are used as part of the apparatus for the Viking space program. Satellites being launched, they're getting more and more high-profile contracts. In 1976, they did $6.8 million in sales, so only a slight increase in sales, less than $1 million increase. $4 million in graphics and about 2.7 million, somewhere in there, 2-point-something million in games. It's flipped.
It did. It really did. Finally, instead of the video games holding up the company, it's really what they originally wanted to do holding up the company.
Exactly. Then in 1978, fiscal year ending in 78, so the year ending June 30th, 1978, $15 million, big jump. The Viking space program's coming in at this point, I'm sure, and some other stuff. $15 million, more than doubled their total revenue. $11 million in graphics, $4 million in games. So the games have remained flat. That's the third year in a row that games came in at about $4 million. The game sales have remained flat, and the graphical system sales are taking the heck off. Also in September 1978, the company goes public. Funny thing about public companies.
They want profits.
Not just that, they want consistency. Shareholders love consistency. They hate surprises. The coin-operated amusement industry is a volatile industry, as I think anyone who has followed this podcast would agree. Volatility isn't great for consistency. Consistency isn't great for shareholders. Shareholders get mad at inconsistent public companies and sell all their shares. Once they went public in 1978, it was very clear that the video game business wasn't for them anymore. They didn't need the profits of it anymore. They really didn't need the headache now that they were a public company. In 1979, they made a decision to start getting rid of the video game stuff. All the games, not just video games, because they're doing this electro-mechanical stuff too. They make the decision to get out of the amusement business. They don't want it anymore. They start out by spinning things off into a separate company called Rainbow Games in 1979 as, I think, a prelude to a sale. It's easier if you disentangle the assets ahead of time. Then in 1980, they sold the whole business to Charles McEwan's brother, Melvin McEwan, who we haven't mentioned, but has been managing a lot of the game business stuff throughout this period. So he was the main guy at the company doing games from at the executive level. And in 1980, he purchases the games assets and renames it Meltec after himself. Based on everything that we've talked about up to this point, you would think, well, there's not much there. How could this have possibly been successful? There's one other game we haven't mentioned yet that we now have to bring into this conversation. It's a little electromechanical game called Boom Ball. Boom Ball was not an internal Ramtek creation. In fact, just as Ramtek's predecessor, Data Disc Corporation, got a big boost when a couple of other former Ampex employees came in and sold them that video technology of theirs, it was a former Ampex guy who brought them the Boom Ball concept. What Boom Ball is basically skee ball if skee ball used a giant air cannon to launch the balls.
Well, that looks fun.
Yes.
Why isn't this at my local arcade? Why wasn't this around when I was a kid? This would be so much more fun than skee ball.
It was around when we were kids, which is why I don't have a good answer for your question, Jeffrey, because I never saw it as a kid either. But it actually was around. And so the Boom Ball concept was brought to Ramtek, and they had to do some work on it at Ramtek. They had to work on the rubber balls. These were rubber balls that were launched. They had to work on kind of the consistency of that. They also actually had to modify the guns, because these guns for Boom Ball were actually so good and so accurate that basically once you had the gun pointed in the right place, once you got a ball in like the highest scoring hole, you could basically just unload your entire clip into that hole and they would all follow it in. Boom, 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 boom. So they actually had to add a recoil effect to the Boom Ball gun to make sure that you couldn't just sink the balls into the highest level targets every time. The Boom Ball concept was completed and released by Ramtek, but then was part of this sale to Charles's brother Mel and became the heart of the Meltec business. Boom Ball was insanely popular. Boom Ball and variants on the game of Boom Ball continued to propel Mel McEwan's business in coin-op all the way until he sold the company to another coin-op firm called Baytech Games in 2003. While Ramtek was only in the amusement business from 1973 to 1980, Mel McEwan, the essential successor of Ramtek, remained in the business for another 20-plus years with Boom Ball as their main product. Now, they never made video games. Meltec is not a subject of discussion for They Create Worlds because they were never in the video game business. They were only doing these other kinds of games. But Boom Ball was definitely a phenomenal hit, and I'm with you, Jeffrey. I wish I could have played some of that as a kid because that just seems delightful.
It really does. The only variant of it that I'm pulling up here that I have played is the one with the clown face where you knock out the teeth.
Yes. That's Big Mouth, I think.
I didn't catch the name.
Doesn't matter. But yes, they did do a variant with the knocking out of the teeth. I'm aware of that one as well. So that's the story of Ramtek, the video game company. Just to very, and I mean very briefly, kind of take the company past that. Of course, they remained in the high-end graphics business. That business had a lot of ups and downs for the company. In the mid-'80s, Tom Adams, whom I mentioned earlier, actually allegedly started falsifying earnings reports. And between 1986 and 1988, they were lying to their shareholders about their profits. Basically, what people believe happened is they were delivering items on consignment, which means that, somebody agrees to let you dump your product someplace and then see what they can sell of it, but they don't actually pay you until they get paid. They had all of these units that they sent out on consignment, but booked those consignment units as sales, even though no money had changed hands. Then when those units ended up not selling after a while, the jig was finally up and they had to admit that they had booked sales that didn't exist. So they got in a bit of trouble in 1988. Shareholder lawsuits, SEC investigations, all of that. Even though Charles McEwan wasn't directly responsible for this and was never charged by the SEC in this, Charles McEwan was forced to resign in the scandal. The company lawyer, James Swanson, took over the company. I know I've often said before on the show that whenever a company's in trouble, it's always very interesting to see who the replacement is and what their specialty is, because that says a lot about where people see the future of the company. When you've put the lawyer in charge, that means you think you're in for a rocky time legally. Pretty much. Swanson did turn the company around. He was the CEO between 88 and 92. He brought in a whole new management team. He redid the product line, which had kind of fallen out of favor, hence the consignment sales that never went anywhere. Turned the company profitable again by the time he left in 1992. They did enter bankruptcy for a period in 89, but they came back out of bankruptcy under his leadership. The history gets hazy after that point. Of course, I haven't researched it closely because none of it has anything to do with video games. The history gets hazy after 92. Adams was charged by the SEC in 92 with, bad acts around the falsification. He settled without having to admit wrongdoing. These are still allegations. It is alleged bad acts because he did not have to admit wrongdoing, but he did have to accept an SEC ban. So the level of punishment, despite the lack of an official admission of guilt, gives you some idea of how credible these charges probably were. But they are alleged. I don't really know what happens to the company after 1992. I know it's gone by 96 because that's when the California Secretary of State's records run out and say that the company has entered forfeiture and been seized by the state of California. But it may have ceased operation even before that because that's just when the paper corporation ceased to exist was 96. Somewhere between 1992, when Swanson left it somewhat profitable, and 1996, when the assets forfeited, things went bad again, so the company no longer exists today. I mean, it's a very rudimentary history, but like I said, none of it has to do with video games. The video game business ends in 1980. It seemed like a great way to get the graphics business funded. Then it became such a big business in itself that it looked like a place worth sticking around in. But as things became more cutthroat and more uncertain in the late 70s, at the exact same time the graphics business was finally finding its footing, they decided it ultimately wasn't worth it and got out. Though one small portion of its legacy continued all the way until 2003.
Really a lot more arcade and electro-mechanical than video game than I was expecting.
Yeah, in the latter period. I mean, they were purely video in the first couple of years, but then they just took this weird detour in the latter part of the decade. Again, like I said, because I think they were worried about being able to keep up in video games and kind of worried about the volatility of video games. So we're looking for other ways that they could make their mark relatively easily and that would maybe bring in something a little steadier. Pre-Space Invaders, as we've talked about video games, they were up, they were down, they were up, they were down, they were up, they were down. I think that worried the McEwans a little bit.
So as we bid farewell to Ramtek and just go on a little trip where we're going to have to figure out where this boom ball lives, what shall we be discussing in our next episode?
Well, I think it's only logical to continue the Ramtek story, so to speak, because while Ramtek is gone, we've seen them off, Meltec didn't have anything to do with video games. There is one other legacy of the company, and that is the video game developer and manufacturer that I very briefly mentioned in the context of Pete Kauffman and Hal Ivey, which is Exidy. Exidy had a much bigger impact on video games than Ramtek did, even though it was also somewhat short-lived in the field, and just like Ramtek, ultimately decided to do anything but video games in the coin-operated space. But Exidy is an important company that we haven't done yet. It kind of flows naturally out of this Ramtek discussion, so yeah, let's keep those vibes going.
And we talked about them before in our Advanced Ball and Paddles episode.
We did, because they did Circus. Of course, they are also created the infamous Death Race. So, lots to talk about. Good chance it'll be a two-parter. I think it'll be a two-parter, because even though they were relatively short-lived in the business, highly impactful.
So we will now see you next time on They Create Worlds, the people and companies that shape the video game industry, Volume 1 and podcast episode 211. And also, enjoy those YouTube versions of it, kids. I'm uploading them, all of them. They're uploading rapidly. You can blame me and my friend helping me to upload them all. Bye-bye. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shape the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. Please help get the word out by leaving a review on your favorite podcasting service. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Check it out, like and follow, or consume it that way if you like it. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roller Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License.